Okay, here's the next video lecture installment for Race and Gender, Bridge Valley Community and Technical College. Again, you want to take notes on this stuff. I'm condensing a lot of Chapter 2 for you here, so this should help. Broader picture of crime victims. Perceptions of crime are often shaped by TV news and newspapers. There are actually studies that show that the media, not exclusively, but largely shapes our perception of crime, and oftentimes for the worse, as information is often distorted. There are actually institutes in place. There's one specifically in Michigan, I think it's Michigan State, that actually trains journalists not to present crime in stereotypical and prejudiced ways. We'll talk more about that as we go. Usually, crime in newspapers and on TV and the media feature young African American or Hispanic males as offenders. And we know most offenders are white males. And there are also female offenders, but a lot of times we don't see them in the news, or they don't get the coverage. And again, usually featuring white people as victims. And again, we know that crime is largely intra-racial. That means, black people typically offend against other black people. White people typically offend against other white people. So it usually features white people as victims. And in some of the exceptions where black people are perpetrating crimes against white people, those stories tend to get a lot of the press, and that's not normally how it happens. So misperception and distortion of information also leads to the presumption that such cases are typical. And obviously, what you see in the news and on the press often is not typical. Many find it difficult to honestly discuss race and crime. Now, the National Crime Victimization Survey, this is mentioned in your textbook, somewhere in the pages 60s and 70s, I believe. It's the most systematic victimization information source. This information, it's survey information. Victims are asked questions about their crimes, or about having crimes perpetrated against them. It's been around since 1973. Provides annual estimates of number and rate of crime. This is different than arrest records or police records. Personal and household statistics. National Crime Victimization Survey produces more of a complete picture of crime and aspects of victims than do police records. So there are different places to look at criminal offending rates and victimization rates. Police records don't always do a good job, and quite frankly, the surveys don't always do a good job. But the Crime Victimization Survey does include data about victimizations that are not reported to the police. Oops, I didn't mean to take that down so quickly. So those are good to have in your notes. Limitations of the National Crime Victimization Survey: does not cover commercial crimes such as convenience store robberies or bank robberies. White-collar crime, these are crimes committed within the workplace, like embezzlement, kidnapping, or homicide. So it's leaving out significant pieces of criminal information and specific categories of crime. The estimates produced are for the nation as a whole. Homeless people are not interviewed, and we know that homeless people often are in trouble with the law. They get arrested at a higher rate than people who are not homeless for various reasons. Responses are susceptible to memory loss, telescoping, exaggeration, misunderstanding, and interviewer bias. So when you talk to people and ask them to provide accounts of crime, they aren't always accurate. So there are some limitations. Some recent data: African Americans are more vulnerable to household victimization in urban and suburban areas, and less vulnerable in rural settings. Hispanic households are more vulnerable than non-Hispanic households. So now we're dealing with household victimization. African American households are more vulnerable than white households. Hispanic households more vulnerable than non-Hispanic ones. So probably not surprising there. So, and we're going to talk specifically more about urbanization and some urban statistics here in just a few minutes. Crime and urbanization. 29% of the population, of the U.S. population, is considered urban, and 38% of all victimizations occur in urban settings. 50% of the U.S. population is considered to be suburban. When you think of urban areas, we're thinking about inner cities, like Chicago, Illinois, for example. and then Los Angeles, for example, New York City. These are urban centers. And then you have suburbs. They're still urban feeling. They still have that city feel, but they kind of lie a little bit outside of that urban area. And that's where half of the U.S. population lives. And that's where most crime occurs. Most people think that most of the crime occurs here in these inner cities, because that's what gets all the press. Most crimes are happening in the suburbs, because that's where, like, especially property crimes, because property is more valuable in suburbs and more people live there. So that stands to reason that more crime would happen there. And then in the countryside, rural population, 20% of people live there, and 20% of all victimizations occur in rural settings. Personal victimization. African Americans are more likely than other groups to be personal crime victims. 2 times more vulnerable to being victims of rape, robbery, and aggravated assault. And there are charts and graphs all through chapter 2. I'm not going to reproduce them here or copy them for you because they're in your book and they're easy to understand, and we're also kind of talking about them here. So please at this point be looking through chapter 2, looking at the tables and the charts as they will reinforce visually what we're talking about largely here. Hispanics have the highest victimization rate for robbery. Highest victimization rate reported for persons self-identified as 2 or more races, so biracial people. Native American women were almost twice the rate as black women to be at a risk for violent victimization. So we don't even talk about Native Americans hardly when we talk about crime. We don't even really consider them as a group, but if we're going to do that and we're going to be fair, Native American women are at a higher rate than black women for violent victimization. Native American females are most likely to be victimized by someone who is using drugs or alcohol. At the time of the incident, African American women were the most likely to call police to report the victimization, whereas Native American women are much less likely to do so. Asian women are the least likely to report victimization. Hispanic females were the least likely to be victimized in the home. Lifetime risk of rape, 1 out of every 12 females and 1 out of every 9 black females are at risk for sexual assault or rape. It's pretty significant. Larson and White research suggests that African American and Hispanic women face higher risks of violence at the hands of strangers than of people they know. African American women face higher risks of violence at the hands of non-strangers than any other group. Now we find, and we'll kind of finish up this part of the video by talking about homicide victimization. We have very striking racial differences. There's a ton of research and some videos, one that I'll probably end up showing you at some point. It's talking about the epidemic of African American homicide, especially in inner cities, and therefore our perception of black crime that comes with that in this country. African American males are at the most risk. 15% of the population in 2008 were African American males. 47.7% of all homicide victims were African American males, especially young African American males. Other group rates have reduced, but African American male rates have increased significantly. I saw some statistics at one time that suggest that African American males are something like 8 times more likely to be the victim of homicide than are white males in this country. I've seen other research that say it could be as high as 12 or 13 times more likely than white males to be homicide victims. So it depends on what research you're looking at. That's pretty much a problem any way you look at it. Here's what we know. White people are at the greatest risk for homicide. There are more white people than black people in this country. That is changing and evolving, but it's still the case. They're at the greatest risk. A homicide related to sex, arson, poison, and gangs. African Americans' greatest risk of homicide are related to illegal drugs. So just to make sure I said that clearly, whites' greatest risk for homicide include things related to sex, arson, poison, and gangs. For African Americans, it's related to illegal drugs. Typical offender portrait. Many associate crime with African Americans. We've talked about that. The perception of crime is associated with street crime. This is crime that happens out on the streets, where they can be easily observed. Police officers aren't going into homes, going into businesses typically looking for crime. They're out patrolling the streets. And largely, and especially in inner cities, African Americans and other minorities are overpopulated and overrepresented in the streets in these inner cities. Therefore, their arrest rates are bound to be higher than white people who are not as visible committing their crimes. African American rates 50.1% arrest rate for murder, 54.7% for robbery, 32.2% for those arrested for rape. Many people have no idea of actual crime other than personal experience, so they base a lot of what they see or what they believe to be true about crime based on what happens to them personally or what they see presented by the media, or through vicarious experience, people who tell them, hey, this happened to me, or they know that their father was assaulted or somebody in their family was assaulted or was the victim of crime. Of course, media images, which we've already kind of dealt with a little bit. Go ahead and call that the end of this part. Thank you.